On the night of March 22, 2006, a small congregation in Selmer, Tennessee, gathered for Wednesday Bible study and waited for their preacher to walk through the door. He never did. What they found instead, inside the church-owned home where he lived with his wife and 3 little girls, would tear apart a town that thought it knew this family better than anyone. The preacher was dead. His wife and children were gone without a trace. And when police finally caught up with them hundreds of miles away, the woman everyone had called the perfect minister's wife would utter 4 words that still haunt this case today. "My ugly came out." This is the story of Mary and Matthew Winkler. And it starts, like most tragedies do, long before the gunshot. Unreal True Crime launches its new book, Unreal True Crime, Latin edition. 35 shocking true murder cases from across Latin America. Buy it now on Amazon. Matthew Bryan Winkler was born on November 21, 1974, in Fort Worth, Texas. To Dan and Diane Winkler, he wasn't just born into a Christian household. He was born into a preaching dynasty. His father, Dan, was a minister. So was his uncle. So was his grandfather, a man remembered across the churches of Christ as a preacher's preacher. Going back generations, the Winkler name meant one thing: the pulpit. As a teenager, Matthew was athletic enough to consider a future in football, but he chose Bible study instead, following the path already laid out by the men before him. Matthew had 2 brothers, Daniel and Jacob, and by all early accounts, church wasn't just something the Winkler boys attended on Sundays. It was the center of their entire family identity, their social life, and their expected future. Around the same years, in a different corner of that same conservative religious world, a girl named Mary Carol Freeman was growing up under similar expectations. Do well in school. Obey your elders. Behave. Be respectable. She wasn't remembered as rebellious or dramatic, just quiet, dutiful, and shaped entirely by church life. She started college at Lipscomb University in Nashville, before transferring to Freed-Hardeman University in Henderson, Tennessee, to study special education. That same campus is where Matthew Winkler was studying too. The two met, and what followed was fast. A 3-month courtship before Matthew proposed. On April 20th, 1996, Mary Carol Freeman became Mary Winkler. From the outside, it looked like the ideal match. 2 young, devout Church of Christ students, marrying within the faith, building a family that would serve God together. But according to what Mary would later testify, the intimidation started almost immediately. She said it built slowly at first, then hardened into something closer to control, belittling, isolation from people she loved, and, she claimed, physical harm. In 2002, Mary asked Matthew for a divorce. He refused. Mary later said she didn't push it further because she was afraid of what he might do. Around this same period, people close to Mary began noticing something was wrong, even if nobody said it out loud. Her sister Tabitha Freeman would later say she couldn't remember hearing Mary laugh anymore, and that Mary simply wasn't a happy person. Another sister, Amanda Miller, said she once saw a bruise on Mary but didn't ask about it, afraid that pushing too hard might push Mary further away. Mary's father, Clark Freeman, said he saw bruises too, and at one point confronted her directly, telling her she seemed like a very abused woman. Mary denied it and insisted everything was fine. Her father said he brought up the subject of leaving Matthew more than once, but Mary never wanted to. Meanwhile, Matthew's ministry career was moving forward exactly as expected. He graduated from Freed-Hardeman in 1999 and took a position as youth minister, first at the Bellevue Congregation in Nashville, and then at Central Church of Christ in McMinnville, Tennessee, from 2002 through 2005. A colleague who worked alongside him during this period would later testify that Matthew brought more discipline and structure into the youth group, a small detail, but one that hinted at a man who liked order and control. Other testimony from that same church period painted a more troubling picture. A church secretary in McMinnville would later say, Matthew seemed pleasant at first, but grew demanding and cruel towards staff over time. And another acquaintance recalled Matthew screaming at him and his family over something as small as a barking dog. None of this was ever treated as proof of wrongdoing, but it planted early seeds of a very different Matthew than the one his congregation believed they knew. By this point, Mary and Matthew already had two daughters, Patricia, born around 1998, and Mary Alice, known as Allie, born around 2000. Publicly, they were the picture of a young ministry family. In January 2005, Matthew received his first appointment as a pulpit minister, the lead preacher, at 4th Street Church of Christ in Selmer, Tennessee, a small town of roughly 4,500 people. The congregation averaged around 175 to 200 people on a Sunday, which in a town that size made Matthew one of its most visible and respected figures almost overnight. 2 months later, on March 9, 2005, the couple's third daughter, Brianna, was born. The Winklers settled into the church-owned home in Selmer and slipped into the rhythm expected of a minister's family. Matthew taught the adult education class. Mary taught the 2- and 3-year-olds in Sunday Bible class. To the congregation, they looked like exactly what a minister's household should look like. One church elder later said that if he'd been asked to name the ideal couples in the congregation, Matthew and Mary would have been near the top of the list. He said he saw no signs of trouble at all. But behind that image, according to Mary's account, life inside the home was very different. She would later testify that Matthew's control extended into their most private moments, that he pressured her into acts that humiliated her, and that on at least one occasion, he put a shotgun in her face and threatened to cut her into pieces if she talked back. At the same time, another pressure was quietly building, this one financial. By early 2006, Mary was still connected to her old education studies, remaining periodically enrolled at Freed-Hardeman School of Education since 1994 and that spring semester, taking 9 credit hours. But alongside that ordinary detail, investigators would later allege that Mary had gotten entangled in a fraudulent check scheme, the kind where a victim is sent counterfeit checks from overseas, in this case reportedly linked to Canada and Nigeria, and told a larger payout is coming. Mary allegedly cashed some of these before they cleared, ended up owing more than $16,000 when the checks bounced, and then began shifting money between different bank accounts to cover the gap, a pattern banks call check kiting. She reportedly opened an account in her name only, changed her mailing address to a P.O. box, and even attempted to remove Matthew's name from one of the accounts entirely. Moves prosecutors would later say were designed to keep Matthew from finding out. Mary was never charged with any financial crime, and she herself would later testify that Matthew was the one who had directed the deposits, a claim prosecutors flatly rejected. The pressure came to a head the day before Matthew died. A bank official contacted Mary and demanded a meeting, a sign prosecutors would later argue that her financial secret was about to be exposed. Then came the morning of March 22, 2006. According to Mary's own testimony, the day began when the youngest daughter, 14-month-old Brianna, started crying. Mary said Matthew got up first, kicked her out of the bed, and went into Brianna's room. Mary claimed that when she checked on them, she saw Matthew covering the baby's mouth and nose to stop the crying, and that Brianna had trouble breathing afterward. This was Mary's account and the defense's theory. It was never independently confirmed by any witness. Mary said she calmed Brianna down and then went back to the bedroom, wanting to talk to Matthew, to ask him, in her words, to stop being so mean. She testified that she remembered picking up the shotgun that was kept in the house, but that she didn't remember pointing it or pulling the trigger. What is not in dispute is what happened next. Matthew Winkler was shot once in the back with a 12-gauge shotgun while he was in bed. The blast drove 77 pellets into his body from a distance of roughly 1 to 4 feet. He did not die instantly. According to statements Mary later gave investigators, Matthew rolled off the bed after being shot, and she wiped his mouth. She said he asked her, "Why?" and that she answered, "I'm sorry." A detective would later find the bedroom telephone unplugged from the wall, its cord tangled beneath where Matthew's head had been. Mary did not call for help. Instead, she gathered her 3 daughters and left. She got into the family minivan, put the shotgun in the trunk, and started driving, eventually covering hundreds of miles, all the way to the Gulf Coast. That night, Matthew failed to show up for Wednesday Bible study at 4th Street Church of Christ. Members of the congregation went to check on him at the house. They found him dead in the bedroom. Mary and the 3 girls were nowhere to be found, and for a brief, terrifying stretch, the town of Selmer feared the whole family had been kidnapped. The next day, police located the Winklers' minivan in Orange Beach, Alabama. Officers pulled the vehicle over, removed the 3 children, and searched the van. Inside the trunk, they found the shotgun. In that moment, Mary went from a missing, possibly endangered wife to the prime suspect in her husband's murder. During questioning, witnesses described her as quiet and subdued, not hysterical, not defensive, almost detached. According to reports from her interrogation, at one point she said, "This is my last time to be with them," a line that suggested she already understood her old life was over, before investigators had even confirmed anything. After roughly 2 hours of questioning, she admitted she had been holding the shotgun, though she maintained she didn't remember firing it. She reportedly told investigators that Matthew could nail her into the ground emotionally. And then she said the words that would follow this case for years. "My ugly came out." Mary Winkler was arrested, waived extradition back to Tennessee on March 25, 2006, and was booked into the McNairy County Jail on a charge of first-degree murder. Her 3 daughters were placed into the temporary custody of Matthew's parents, Dan and Diane Winkler. The case exploded into national news almost immediately. A small-town preacher shot dead, his wife and children vanished, then found hundreds of miles away with the murder weapon in the trunk. It had every element that turns a local tragedy into a story the entire country follows. The trial began in April 2007, and it split almost immediately into two completely different stories about the same marriage. Prosecutors argued this was about money, not fear. Their theory: Mary's financial deception was about to be exposed, the bank was closing in, and she killed Matthew to stop the truth from coming out. They pointed to the sequence of actions: retrieving the shotgun, loading it, chambering a round and firing into her husband's back while he lay in bed, as evidence of premeditation, not panic. One prosecutor later said publicly that he believed the evidence of premeditation was awfully good, citing that same chain of deliberate steps. Witnesses for the prosecution, including the couple's oldest daughter, Patricia, testified that Matthew was a good father and that she had never seen him mistreat her mother. The defense told a different story entirely. Mary's attorneys argued that what the congregation saw as a marriage made in heaven was, behind closed doors, years of intimidation, control, and alleged sexual humiliation. In one of the trial's most talked about moments, the defense produced a white platform shoe and a wig, which Mary said Matthew had forced her to wear during sex. A local reporter later said the courtroom audibly gasped when the items were shown, and that the moment seemed to genuinely shift how some observers in the room viewed the entire case. The defense also revisited that morning's alleged confrontation over baby Brianna, arguing Mary had picked up the gun in a moment of panic and protective rage after believing Matthew had endangered their daughter, not as part of any calculated plan. But that same defense faced a serious problem. No witness at trial corroborated Mary's detailed abuse allegations. No one testified to seeing an injury that Mary herself confirmed had come from Matthew. Matthew's own parents testified they'd never seen any sign of abuse in the marriage. Diane Winkler, Matthew's mother, said plainly that the monster her son had been painted as simply did not exist, and that Mary had wounded his memory a second time by making claims no one could verify. On April 18, 2007, the jury reached its verdict. They rejected the prosecution's theory of first-degree murder. They also rejected the idea of full innocence. Mary Winkler was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, a middle ground verdict that satisfied no one completely. On June 8, 2007, Judge Weber McCraw sentenced her to 3 years. But factoring in time already served and the judge's decision to allow mental health treatment instead of straight incarceration, Mary's actual remaining custody came out to 210 days, with up to 60 of those days served in a mental health facility rather than a prison cell. For Matthew's family, the case didn't end with the sentence. It moved into a custody war. Dan and Diane Winkler, who had been raising the 3 girls since the murder, pursued adoption and moved to terminate Mary's parental rights, while also filing a $2 million wrongful death lawsuit against her, a move legal observers believed was partly meant to prevent Mary from ever profiting off book or movie deals. Mary fought back for custody of her daughters, and at one point appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show, using the platform both to give her account of what she said had happened inside the marriage and to make the case for getting her girls back. In August 2008, the two sides reached an informal agreement. Mary would regain custody of her 3 girls. while Matthew's parents retained visitation rights. In the years that followed, Mary largely disappeared from the spotlight. Reporting years later found her living quietly in rural Tennessee, no longer the frail and timid preacher's wife seen at trial, but a woman trying to build something resembling a normal life for her daughters, even talking about renting rural property where the girls could simply run and play outside. That same period brought a new personal battle. After experiencing troubling problems with her hands and feet that initially made her fear she'd had a stroke, Mary was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She described the diagnosis as frightening and difficult to process. In more recent years, when reporters have reached out, she has said she no longer wants to discuss the case publicly. Her response has stayed consistent. We've moved on. Technical and forensic analysis. The physical evidence in this case is what made the accident defense so difficult to accept for many observers. Matthew was killed with what was described in court as a 12-gauge turkey gun, fired from 1 to 4 feet away while he was lying in bed. The blast sent 77 individual pellets into his back, fracturing his spine and tearing through internal organs. A firearms expert confirmed the weapon was fully functional, undercutting any suggestion of a mechanical malfunction. To fire it, someone had to retrieve the shotgun, load it, and rack a shell into the chamber. A sequence of deliberate steps that prosecutors leaned on heavily to argue against the idea of a pure accident. Each of those steps requires conscious action, and the prosecution built its entire premeditation argument around exactly that sequence, arguing that a truly accidental discharge simply doesn't require loading a weapon and chambering a round beforehand. The autopsy added another disturbing layer. The medical examiner determined that Matthew likely continued breathing for a short time after the shot. He had aspirated blood, consistent with Mary's own account that he rolled off the bed and spoke to her before he died, expected to have died within minutes rather than instantly. And then there's the telephone, found unplugged from the wall, its cord tangled beneath Matthew's head. Prosecutors argued this showed Mary made sure he couldn't call for help in his final minutes. The defense pushed back, saying there was no way to prove Mary was the one who disconnected it, or when it happened relative to the shooting. Combined, these details built a forensic picture of a wounded man who may have survived those first critical minutes during which no call for help was ever made. Psychological analysis. At the center of this case sits one of the most difficult questions in criminal psychology. What do you do with an abuse claim that can't be independently verified? Mary described years of intimidation, isolation, and sexual coercion. Her family, her father, her sisters, described a woman who had visibly changed after marriage, quieter, sadder, once seen with unexplained bruises she refused to discuss. That pattern is consistent with what psychologists recognize in coercive control dynamics, where victims minimize or deny abuse even to people who love them, often out of fear, shame, or the sense that no one will believe them over a respected minister. But the absence of corroboration matters too. No friend, church member, or medical professional ever documented an injury tied directly to Matthew. That doesn't disprove the abuse. Domestic violence is notoriously private and underreported, especially in closed religious communities, where a wife's role is to submit and preserve the household's image. But it left the jury and the public forced to weigh one person's account against a total lack of outside confirmation. Then there's her own phrase, "My ugly came out." It's a striking piece of language, not a claim of self-defense, not a flat denial, but a description of something surfacing from underneath a carefully maintained exterior. Whether that ugly was the product of years of trauma finally breaking loose, the panic of a woman about to be financially exposed, or some combination of both, is exactly the question the jury couldn't fully answer either, which is likely why they landed on voluntary manslaughter instead of a verdict at either extreme. It's also worth noting how consistently people described Mary as passive and conflict avoidant her entire life, a trait that can either reflect a genuine victim who never had the tools to leave, or a person capable of concealing serious problems, including financial ones, behind an agreeable surface for years at a time. The Winkler case never gave anyone a clean ending. Not the prosecution, not the defense, not the church, and not the family left behind. A preacher was killed, a marriage was put on trial after his death, and a small Tennessee town has spent nearly 2 decades quietly disagreeing about who Mary and Matthew Winkler really were behind closed doors. If you want more true crime cases that dig past the headlines into the full story, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.